Good afternoon, welcome everybody. Today I am really thrilled to welcome my very good friend, Professor Allison Mickel, to Yale's Council on Middle East Studies. Allison and I were in graduate school together at Stanford, and it's just a really great honor to have her here. So Professor Allison Mickel is an Assistant Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and Assistant Director of Global Studies at Lehigh University. Her research focuses on how local communities have impacted and been affected by the long history of archaeological work in the Middle East. By interviewing current and former site workers employed on archaeological projects and utilizing statistical and visual methods like social network analysis, Allison Mickel maps, measures, illustrates, transcribes, outlines, and stipples the roles that local community members play in the processes of archaeological knowledge production. She has excavated in Jordan, Turkey, Kenya, and the United States. Her first book, Archaeologists as Authors and the Stories of Sites, Defending the Use of Fiction in Archaeological Writing, was published in 2012 and focused on the politics of representation and public engagement in publications about archaeology. Today, she's presenting work from her new book, Why Those Who Shovel Are Silent, A History of Local Archaeological Labor and Knowledge. It focuses on the ways in which archaeological excavations rely on the expertise that locally hired laborers possess about archaeological remains and methodologies. The book ultimately examines the ways in which the economics of labor management and the epistemology of archaeology are intertwined. It was published in 2021 with the University Press of Colorado, and you should all read it. Professor Mickel was recently awarded a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities to undertake another ethnographic project, which centers on two new private companies in Jordan that advocate for the recognition of local expertise and fair labor conditions on archaeological excavations. You know, I have to say that Allison's work about power and the epistemology of disciplinary knowledge couldn't be more timely, as our broader community has, as we speak, been sent reeling from scandals about the patronage systems at the core of our discipline. And it's important not to lose track of how that kind of power continues and correlates with geopolitical inequalities, and how it's at the core of how we think about field and home. So thank you, Allison. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction. I also was going to just remark on this moment that we're in, and the announcement of this continuing evidence coming out from Harvard and the ongoing sexual violence that has been happening and has been covered up there. And I think it's a hard time to be an anthropologist. It's a hard time to feel invested in the project of anthropology in some ways. And so I'm hoping that my work doesn't feel tone deaf, but instead speaks to this moment rather than speaking past this moment, and highlights issues of power and representation and who is excluded and exploited by the work we do. I also am hoping that my work offers some ways forward at the very end and some hope. And while that's not intended to excuse the harm that has been done within anthropology and archaeology, I'm hoping that there is something worth rescuing in this work that we all do and that we care about deeply enough to dedicate so much of our lives to. So thanks for contextualizing in that way, because I also felt the same. So yeah, today I will be speaking about my book, which is called Why Those Who Shovel Are Silent, A History of Local Archaeological Knowledge, Labor and Knowledge. Knowledge and labor. The title of the talk is the same as the book, and so if the issues and methods and data that I'm raising here speaks to interests that you have, the book expands on these and goes further into detail, but I really want to kind of hit the highlights today. So I am an archaeologist. I am trained as an archaeologist. I started working in Jordan in 2010. And I noticed immediately when I started working in archaeology, how much of our work relies on local community members who are hired to carry out most of the physical and manual work of archaeology. So when most people think of archaeology, they are thinking of these excavation projects where soil is being moved from one place to another. And archaeology is changing. We have new technologies that are sort of minimizing the impact on the earth and the excavation that we're doing, but it doesn't sort of change the fact that for hundreds of years, we have been relying on people who live on and around archaeological sites to work on our projects and to do that sort of hard manual labor that reveals new antiquities and reveals sites. And this goes back truly multiple hundreds of years. We see it in drawings, we see it in photographs. This image on the left is from Austin Henry Layard's famous excavations at Nimrud. And he includes in his publications very colorful depictions of the people that he hired. He sort of does this kind of like ethnographic, but like colonial ethnographic work where he's describing the communities and what they're like and kind of differentiating between their religious traditions and their kind of local social structures. So we see them show up and we know that they're doing a lot of the archaeological work, but they're also kind of hidden, like they only show up in the ways that he's interested in depicting them. And in these moments where they're assisting in the removal of artifacts from the place where they live to be taken away to the Louvre or to the British Museum in Layard's case. And then, through the 20th century, this continues. We still have these massive teams of locally hired laborers. This is Woolley's team photographed at Ur, and I think this photograph is so evocative of the sort of facelessness of these local community members. They're hired kind of en masse. They're often replaceable, and it's not really until very recently that it became a common practice to publish lists of the people that you hired from the local community who were employed on your project. But it was kind of common practice to say say the names of the foreigners who were part of your project. So there's a lot of erasure of the contributions of these local laborers from the early history of the discipline. And I think even now, we publish sometimes lists of workers, but they're not credited necessarily with finds. And there's a lot of work that's been written about the disjunction between the intellectual work supposedly of archaeology and the manual or physical work of archaeology, where excavation is seen as this very bodily, physical, manual activity that doesn't require skill or expertise. And then the work of like identifying artifacts, taking them to the lab, writing about them, putting it all in context, that's seen as intellectual. And some work has been written about, there has been work written about how that's problematic and how that's not actually the case, coming from archaeologists, but also drawing a lot on STS work, suggesting that actually the work of excavation is a very expert task. It requires recognizing stratigraphy, not breaking artifacts. But the history of archaeology is really rife with this really entrenched belief in the separation between these two activities. And local community members, local workers are very definitively sorted into that manual, not intellectual, not expert task. At the same time, there are these moments, these glimpses in the archives where we do see them referred to as experts and recognized as experts. In fact, Seton Lloyd, a very famous British archaeologist, in his memoirs explicitly refers to the Shirkati workmen who come from the village of Shirkat in Iraq. He says he refers to them as our invaluable Shirkati experts, and he describes how he arrived on site and started trying to dig a mud brick site. And realized that mud brick is very difficult to excavate. I don't know how many archaeologists are in the audience, but archaeology really relies on differentiating between materials, and mud brick is made of mud, and so it can very easily look like the surrounding area. It takes a lot of expertise to learn how to recognize it and how to dig in a way that you're revealing it and not destroying it. Seton Lloyd talks about how he arrived on site, didn't know how to do that, couldn't recognize mud brick. And in fact, the Shirkati trained him and much of his team on how to do that, how to recognize the mud brick. He writes about how they had initially been trained by some German excavators, but they had developed those skills much further and in fact designed an entire archaeological toolkit, like new equipment for excavating mud brick and for revealing it. And so to me, this is a very clear example of the expertise that local workers are contributing, but only gets mentioned in sort of the context of these memoirs as kind of a charming anecdote, but not really like the focus of the memoir, of the book, of the text. And so I started thinking about how many examples there would be of people like the Shirkati workmen who had developed expertise from having worked for decades or generations in archaeology, but maybe didn't get mentioned offhand in someone's memoirs and didn't get named in texts. And so my project that I'm talking about in my book is a 6-year ethnographic project where I went to Turkey and to Jordan. I went to the sites Çatalhöyük in Turkey and Petra in Jordan. And I went to go find workmen who had worked on archaeological projects for a long time in these two places. Both of these two sites, even though they're in different countries and have different histories of sort of the national approach to archaeology, they share sort of similar excavation histories. They were both initially excavated in the 1960s. So you have this long history of excavation in both places. Both places, the workmen were sort of hired familially. So like jobs would be passed either from father to son or from a man to his brother or to his cousin. So you see that you have these families of archaeological, what I will hope you will agree are experts who have developed expertise over generations. And then the contemporary projects on both sites were both invested in a lot of social engagement and community engagement. This is becoming much more common in archaeology in general, but these two sites, I think, are well known, at least nationally, if not regionally, for trying to invest a lot of thought and time and effort and resources into community engagement. Both sites were among the first in their contexts to hire women on archaeological projects. And so they were really good contemporary projects to partner with and do this sort of reflexive historical reappraisal of the epistemology of archaeology at these two sites, because they were both invested in bringing local communities more into the fold of the archaeological endeavor. And so they were open to a sort of critical look at what had happened in the past. And so I used archives from both sites, from Çatalhöyük and from specifically the Temple of the Winged Lions in Petra. Petra's a really massive city, but I was focusing on one particular site where there'd been this long history of excavation. So I looked at archives from both of these two sites, and I identified in the end around a couple of hundred workmen total who I interviewed in Arabic and in Turkish. At both sites, I had a research assistant, but they didn't serve a translating purpose in Jordan. In Turkey, they translated for me because the people that I was interviewing use a very like local rural dialect of Turkish, and I just couldn't quite get the nuances. So I interviewed all these people and I asked them what they remembered about working on the site. Sometimes we would go to the site and they would show me, sometimes they would sort of talk about it in the abstract. And I recorded, in particular, the artifacts that they remembered, the methods that they remembered using, their interpretations of the archaeological site. And my goal was really to try and show what expertise they had developed over all of these years of working in archaeology. And I think I succeeded. I think that they showed me that they had a lot of expertise from working in archaeology. I used social network analysis really to illustrate that expertise. So I will show you these networks. I think some people they make immediate sense to, and some people they don't. So I'll do my best to explain, but I'm happy in Q&A to kind of explain them further. So social network analysis is a graphical method. It comes from graph theory, and it is based on the idea that you can connect to things, to entities, to people, to places, to institutions on the basis of some sort of linkage. And so what I did was I linked either site workers or excavators who mentioned the same artifact with the site workers that was in those interviews that I was conducting, with the archaeological team it was in the archives from the project. And so I linked them up, and these are the images that I produced as a result of that. So the red are coded as the foreign archaeologists, and the blue are coded as the site workers on the project. And so I'll talk you through what this all means. So what you can see in Petra is that the archaeologists are clustered together right at the center. They're really bound up together. And so what that means is that they're describing the same artifacts over and over again in their archives. They're all mentioning that they found ceramics. They're all mentioning that they found bone. They're mentioning the same things over and over again. And so they form this really dense cluster of people who are discussing the same things. And the site workers appear out towards the periphery. They're very literally peripheral to the overall network. I think we can consider this network a structure of the memory or of the knowledge about artifacts from this site. And so if we want to kind of interpret that, we're seeing site workers as peripheral to the knowledge of artifacts. But if we dig deeper about why site workers are pushed to the outside, it's because they're remembering different artifacts from what the site workers are recording in their artifacts in their archives, in their site notebooks. And more specifically, what the site workers that I was interviewing or remembering were very unique, special artifacts that in the site notebooks were just sort of recorded, maybe very briefly, maybe not at all. And the site workers were remembering kind of every detail about it. So one example of this is I was interviewing a man named Nawaf one day, and he described a bronze eagle that he remembered finding in the 1980s. And I had read through the site notebooks very well, very closely, because I had developed my list of the site workers. I needed to know all the names that were mentioned in these site notebooks from this site. And I didn't remember anything about a bronze eagle. So I went back home and I was like pouring through the site notebooks, frantically looking for anything that could be a bronze eagle. And I found one line that was like almost like scratched out, and it said gold and then scratched out bronze eagle. And it was like, 0.5 meters from the bulk, which is the edge of the trench. And that's all it said. It didn't say any other details. But Nawaf, because I kind of was skeptical about this find, honestly, when he first told me, because I didn't remember reading anything about it. He was like, no, really, we found a bronze eagle. It was this big. And he showed me a picture of the hunting falcons that the Bedouins in this area use in the Wadi Araba. He showed me the falcons. He was like, it looked a lot like this, and it was for the roof. It was a decoration on the roof. So he was offering me the size. He told me exactly where it was found. He told me what its original use was. And in the site notebook, there was really nothing, there was not that much detail about this artifact. And so I think what this network analysis is showing is that site workers are possessing complementary knowledge to what the site notebooks are recording. And so they do have expertise. Their expertise is, like I'm saying, complementary and specific and detailed, and the same way that our memories work. We remember things that stand out to us. We remember things that are special and unique. And I think that's what this network is illustrating. The people I interviewed from Petra had worked on the project primarily in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. There were some people who had worked into the 2000s. But the Petra project really represents an older model of archaeology, one where we weren't bringing site workers into the fold of archaeological work. The site workers at Çatalhöyük are a different story. The site workers at Çatalhöyük that I interviewed primarily had started working there in the 1990s, once that project had already started its community engagement efforts. And I think we can see the effects of that in this network analysis. So I don't know how clear they are, but the blue dots of the site workers are dispersed throughout the network here. They're not shoved out to the periphery. They're really scattered throughout. And that's because the archives from Çatalhöyük and the oral histories from the site workers were very similar to each other in structure. They were naming a lot of the same artifacts. They were naming the same sort of range of artifacts. And so we're not seeing a super distinct difference between the archaeologists and what they remember and the site workers and what they remember, what the archaeologists are recording, I guess, and what the site workers are remembering. We're seeing the site workers occupy a very similar position in the structure of knowledge about the artifacts to the archaeologists. And so to me, this illustrates the impact of these community engagement efforts and the ways that they can actually invite and promote knowledge sharing and knowledge flow between the people who have been historically excluded from doing that in archaeology and the people at the core of archaeology. Either way, I think we're seeing that site workers possess expertise. It's just about how can the structure of our projects facilitate the sharing of that knowledge, the mutual exchange of that knowledge? We're doing that well at Çatalhöyük, but we weren't doing that as well at Petra. It was an earlier project. It's not incredibly surprising. Like I said, I did a similar analysis with methodologies and with the approaches to excavation. I performed network analysis on that material too, on the basis of the archives mentioning a particular methodological approach to archaeological excavation, and the site workers mentioning the same one. And so you'll notice that it lays out in a similar pattern, where again, in Petra, this project that started a little earlier, that hadn't done a lot of community engagement work, that wasn't trying to facilitate and support knowledge sharing between the foreign archaeological team and the site workers, we see again the site workers are pushed out to the periphery. They remembered complementary excavation approaches to what the archaeologists were writing and recording in their site notebooks. And this had a lot to do with the fact the site notebooks were structured. Again, they kind of were formulaic. The site supervisors were supposed to record the same information day to day. So there wasn't room as much for specialized methodologies that the site workers were remembering. I'll also just offer that the site workers were remembering and telling me about methods and skills that the foreign archaeological team never did. So there's sort of like menial tasks in archaeology, like washing pottery or sweeping a site for a photo, that are seen as sort of unskilled labor. And so a lot of the methods that the site workers are remembering, when I said like, what does the process of archaeology entail? What are the steps to archaeology? They were like, well, you gotta wash your artifacts, you gotta dump your soil somewhere. And these were things that just were sort of seen as like sort of automatic, I think, or not worth recording in the site archives. And so we don't see the archaeologists talking about them. We see the site workers talking about them, but they are skilled. They are definitely skilled endeavors. Like where you dump your soil requires knowledge of where that soil is going to end up ultimately. You don't want it blowing back into your site. So you have to know about topography and winds when you dump soil. And washing pottery, it actually does require a lot of skill. There are definitely people who are worse and better at washing pottery. And so I think this network of knowledge about skills from Petra is illustrating our perception of unskilled labor versus skilled labor, as well as sort of methods that were used infrequently that the site workers were talking about. At Çatalhöyük, I know it looks a little bit like the site workers are pushed to the periphery of the network here. They kind of look like they're, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but they're kind of along the lower left-hand side. That's a little bit of a I don't know, I'm watching a lot of Olympics right now. I'm watching a lot of curling, and you can't always tell how close things are to the center. That's what I've learned. And so I performed another statistical analysis on this network from Çatalhöyük, Turkey. I performed an assessment called Modularity Classes, and it basically tries to break the network into natural groups, creating as little disruption as possible. It says if we were to split this network into different groups, what would it look like? And I performed this analysis because I thought this would tell us about specialties or specialisms within the methodological structure represented here. And when I did that, the algorithm spat out 7 modularity classes. That's what it told me was ideal. The algorithm tells you kind of what the like best outcome is. It tells you whether it's better to do 4, 6, or 7, or 10. And it said 7 was the best, the most natural separation of this network. And what I found was that the site workers separated out into these 7 classes. There's one that's not represented. I'll tell you why in a second, but basically separated out into all of these modularity classes, that the site workers occupied specialties, methodological specialties that mapped well onto the methodological specialties represented by the overall team working at Çatalhöyük. We see people talking about digging, that's modularity class 0. We have people talking about layers, like arbitrary versus stratigraphic layers in excavation, that's modularity class 2. We have people talking about excavations of human remains, modularity class 3. And modularity class 4 was really about kind of this like multi-sensory aspect of excavation. It was a small modularity class, but it included both archaeologists and site workers. We had a lot of people talking about experimental and ethnoarchaeology in modularity class 5. And then measurements was Modularity Class 6. The one that's not represented was Modularity Class 1. That was people talking about GPR and subsurface radar, which was something that site workers were really never involved with at this project. But they were represented in every other modularity class, which I think is good evidence that, again, this social engagement work, this community engagement work at Çatalhöyük had done a good job of inviting local site workers into a lot of different dimensions of the archaeological project and giving them exposure and skills into things that interested them. And they ran with it. You know, they developed their skills in these different areas and aspects of the archaeological project. And so they actually exhibit the same, they're kind of a microcosm of the overall specialties of the archaeological project. So I hope that I have convinced you that the local community members who are hired on these archaeological projects have a lot of expertise that is important to the archaeological record, both about artifacts and about methods, two like core aspects of the archaeological endeavor. But whenever I would say to a site worker at both sites, so even though Çatalhöyük had done such a good job of investing effort into community engagement, it happened at Çatalhöyük too, that when I asked site workers or mentioned or remarked, wow, you have a lot of expertise, you know, عندك خبير, it's like amazing, you know, you're really an expert. They would say, no, I don't have any expertise. They would say, I don't know anything about the science of archaeology, or I just worked as a simple worker. I don't have any expertise. I'm just a simple Bedouin, I'm just a simple farmer. And so to me, this represented a flaw and something I was going to have to explain, that over and over again, people were denying that they had the expertise that they had very clearly showed me that they had. You know, this was after telling me that they could date Nabatean pottery and that they knew that the destruction layer for Petra was a meter and a half down, and like just incredible expertise, but they would deny having it. And so I started having to listen a little bit closely to their other memories of the archaeological project, not just the things that I was kind of interested in teasing out from the oral history interviews. I had to listen to what they were telling me about their experiences on the archaeological project. And what they told me was that when they suggested alternate ways of doing archaeology or new ways of digging or different conservation approaches, they would be told that that wasn't what they were brought there to do. They weren't brought there to ask questions or challenge the archaeological process. This is a quote, the top one is a quote from an interview that I did, and a person named Ahmed told me when they found something, they wouldn't believe my ideas because they thought I was just a Bedouin. As if that's self-evident, as if that's like synonymous with like not knowing anything about archaeology. It is not. They know he knew a lot about working in archaeology. You know, the irony in archaeology is that very often the people who are supervising the digs might be undergraduate students or graduate students with sort of minimal excavation experience. So they're supervising people who have 20, 30, 40 years of experience. And those people with so much expertise are being told that they shouldn't speak up. And more specifically, people would tell me that they would be fired or demoted or replaced with their brother if they did speak up, if they did say, we should do this another way, we should dig another way, we should dig somewhere else. And I found evidence for this sort of thing in the archives. One of the site notebooks, the quote on the bottom is from one of the site notebooks from the Petra project, where a site supervisor refers to the site workers as the Kitty Brigade. I don't think I need to elaborate too much on sort of the infantilization of non-white men by Orientalists, by white scholars for a very long time. So they refer to them as the Kitty Brigade, say they needed more pay. And so the director simply fired the whole lot of them. And the tone of this was very kind of like celebratory, sort of like, you know, he really stood up to them. And that's not uncommon. So I'm seeing expertise being punished according to their accounts of their time on the project. They talked about being fired for all sorts of things, but specifically raising expertise or asking questions, correcting a dating of a particular pot or ceramic piece. All of these were grounds for some sort of financial punishment, some sort of consequence. On the other hand, at both sites, I was seeing accounts of ways that simplicity or a performance of simplicity or ignorance or sort of anti-modernness was being rewarded. I saw it at Petra very strongly, where there is a very robust tourist industry. At Petra in 1985, the Bedouin community was moved out because they were seen as anachronistic with the portrayal that UNESCO thought that tourists would want to see in Petra. So it is nothing new to say that the Bedouins in Petra are sort of asked to play a role of being kind of like anti-modern, because now when they work in the site, they're supposed to kind of act like Nabateans, act like they're not anachronistic to the site. But what was surprising was to see the same thing happen at Çatalhöyük as well, the same thing play out at Çatalhöyük as well. And so even though Çatalhöyük has invested so much into social engagement and community participation in the archaeological research process, very often the roles that have been available for local community members to play on the archaeological site is quite literally to role play a Neolithic person. And I don't think this is meant in an insulting way or meant to be harmful, but what I saw was that people I was talking to had recognized that there were more opportunities for them to earn money, to earn wages, or to earn more recognition or earn more opportunities if they participated in these kind of experiments or recreations of the past. And so a woman that I interviewed had been asked to participate in a documentary where she was grinding grain like a Neolithic person. And so she said the directors told us some things to do, like where to look and where to go, but the grinding of the grain, my grandmother, even my mother ground grain like this. So I knew from them what to do. And so she wasn't upset about having participated in this documentary. But I did ask her, I was like, oh, have you seen it? Are you, was it interesting to see yourself on TV? And she said, I don't know, I've never seen that documentary. We don't have access to that channel. And so I think there's some alienation from sort of product of these recreations, of these inhabiting the past, playing the role of the Neolithic person. That again, I don't think is like ill-minded. I don't think it's with bad intent, but it does have a very long history in archaeology, way, way, way back to Layard. Layard would commission drawings of the local community members within the archaeological sites to be like, oh, this is what a Neo-Assyrian person would have looked like in this site, which is obviously problematic. Even though the people living in a place today may have some sort of cultural attachment or affiliation to people in the past, they are not people of the past. This is a sort of offensive claim to say that the people living in Turkey, living at Çatalhöyük today, are Neolithic and that they automatically know how to be Neolithic or play Neolithic, just because they are still like a farming community. And so I did see people kind of expressing some pride in these opportunities that they had participated in. And so my argument is not that those opportunities are themselves problematic, but when that is the main way in which local community members are engaged in the project, there is this like reward, there's this financial incentive to perform Neolithicness. And so people would say things to me like, I'm the daughter of the Neolithic people, which is especially interesting because at Çatalhöyük, there is no sort of biological or genetic connection, we don't think, between the people in the past and the people who live there today. And when archaeology started at Çatalhöyük, people really didn't claim that affiliation. So that is very much an outcome of the archaeological work and the opportunities that have been created. That feeling of affiliation is an outcome of that, for better or for worse. But I do think it plays into a phenomenon that I call in my book lucrative non-knowledge. And I think it's similar. It has comparisons and similarities to ideas of like affective labor or performative incompetence. But specifically, I've chosen this language because what we've done is created a microeconomy where rejecting, denying knowledge is specifically what pays. So performing ignorance specifically pays. And it's a strange thing because you shouldn't actually be incompetent. You shouldn't actually be bad at your job. Like, you can also be fired if you break a pot while you're digging. You can also be fired if you miss a floor and you dump the soil in the wrong place. So you actually should be good at your job, but you shouldn't be knowledgeable about it. You shouldn't be expert about it. You shouldn't be analytical or intellectual about it. It is much more lucrative if you feign ignorance about the archaeological project. And so I think this could have a lot of applications to other sectors, other industries, but in archaeology specifically, I think it has a role and it has impacted what we actually know about the past. So when I think about archaeology, I think about it as a form of production. We are producing, physically, we are producing knowledge about the past. We are producing an assemblage. We are producing an archaeological record. And laborers are performing a role in that production effort. And so I think lucrative non-knowledge is divorcing laborers from the products of the work that they're doing. It is very much kind of like hallmark, iconic Marxian alienation. And I think that the products that we produce are actually poorer because of it. I think that if we're incentivizing people not to share what they know, we're producing more limited archaeological knowledge. And I don't think that's like totally foreign to science studies, but I do think, you know, when I talk about this issue, I do like to compare it to other scientific fields where, you know, if producing the vaccine for COVID had relied on people not sharing information, like we would have gotten there a lot less quickly. And so when we think about what archaeology is producing and our ideas of the past, it is poorer, it is more limited, it is weaker, it is less nuanced because of this phenomenon of lucrative non-knowledge. I also think that this all speaks to issues of political economy in the Middle East. All of this is very, very much tied up in the history of archaeology and the role archaeology has played in colonialism and still plays a role in like diplomatic efforts in the Middle East. There's been a lot of writing about archaeology as a form of soft power and how archaeologists often kind of act as diplomats on the ground. And I think that archaeology is a useful microcosm for thinking about macro processes and how they play out between Europe and America and the Middle East. You know, we're seeing the effects of these broader processes of political economy play out in the interpersonal relationships between excavators and site workers on the ground. I promised some hope. I promised some ways forward. I'm not sort of trying to suggest that this is the way it has to be or will always be by any means. And so towards the end of my project, I was interested in seeing whether if we actually changed what we task site workers to do, what we trust them to do, and more specifically, what we pay them to do, would they be interested in sharing their knowledge about the archaeological record and about the archaeological process. And to be clear, I think that that experiment or that pursuit benefits archaeologists. I didn't do this out of sort of like a, I don't know, like universal humanity, like we all own the world sort of idea where like there's an intrinsic benefit to sharing knowledge, because I don't think that's the case. I think that this transformation where if we are going to ask site workers to share their knowledge with us, it has to come with a material change in the structural conditions of archaeological labor. And so I worked with the heads of the two projects I was working on at Petra and Çatalhöyük to not only give site workers cameras, but actually to change their job description for the weeks that they had those cameras so that they were actually tasked and recognized and like time was carved out for them to photograph their perspectives on the archaeological process. So I gave them cameras and I said, okay, like, would you be interested in photographing the archaeological process from your perspective, what you think is important about it, and having that be part of your job? And I think the only concerns I got were like, what happens if we break the camera? I was like, it's fine, I'll buy a new one, it'll be all right. And I think that the results are really telling and really exciting, honestly. So these are photos produced from Çatalhöyük, and I think they exhibit, I don't know, a different eye on the archaeological process than we normally get. So the photos on the left are all of the flotation process. That's where we take samples of soil and we run them through machines with water and we separate out kind of tiny archaeological materials that we otherwise wouldn't be able to see. And this is a process that site workers have essentially been in charge of for a lot of years at Çatalhöyük as part of that community engagement effort, you know, giving them more authority and control over entire dimensions of the archaeological process. But there are almost no photos of the flotation process in the archive from Çatalhöyük. There are some, but Çatalhöyük ran for 25 years. There are, I believe, at least tens of thousands of photos, if not hundreds of thousands of photos in the archive. I don't remember the exact number, but for there to be so few photos of flotation is pretty wild. And the reason is because it's something that happens outside of the view of archaeologists, but it happens within the view of site workers. And so site workers were invested, they were interested in documenting this process that is really theirs from start to finish. The second set of photos is also from Çatalhöyük. And yeah, they're sort of strange photos. They might not seem strange right on their surface, but if you try to tell me what these photos are of, they're sort of the archaeological remains, but they're also sort of archaeology at work. And in the photo archive of, again, tens or hundreds of thousands of photos, I believe it's hundreds of thousands of photos from Çatalhöyük, we have photos of people at work that are like portraits, they're composed, you know, the people are the subject. We have photos of archaeological remains where they're cleaned up, maybe there's a north arrow, you know, they're set up to be scientific documentation. These sort of in-between photos don't really exist. And I think, again, it speaks to the site workers' experience of kind of being in this interstitial space between the manual work of archaeology and the intellectual work of archaeology. The photo archive from Çatalhöyük had done a really good job of sorting out those two separately and documenting them separately. But these photos kind of bring them together in the same way that I think site workers' real work brings the two together. And so to me, these photos point to new modes of documentation, new ways of looking at archaeology, and new information that we wouldn't have had otherwise. I had similar results at Petra. So these are the photos from Petra. The photos on the left are photos that an older woman, Agela, she's like 4'8" and like a matriarch in her family. And so I gave her the camera. And on day one, like she did not know how to turn it on. And then by like day 5, she was walking around the site. And these photos are all kind of taken looking outward from the site, like in all directions. And in archaeology, the kind of concept of the site is a little bit sacred, like your photos are very much of the site within the site. And I think that the photos of kind of placing the site in context really speak to her own experience of the site. She's someone who lives in this area and doesn't experience the site as a discrete entity. She experiences it as a total landscape. And I think her photos illustrate that. And then the photos on the right are from a team member named Shaker. He was very interested in taking these like candid photos of people, which historically we do have at Çatalhöyük, but we just don't really have in archaeology. There's some work that's been written by people like Ruth Tringham on the importance of these sorts of candid shots of people and placing people back into the process of archaeological knowledge production. And I think Shaker did a great job of that. It was also sort of jarring to get the photos back and see a photo of myself that I hadn't remembered being taken. And so I think that was also like a good reminder that like, this is an important key to the reflexive archaeological process and not thinking about archaeology as like objectively done. As I was concluding my project, the site workers who I gave the cameras to in Petra, you know, I don't mean to like claim this idea as my own, but I think they saw this as an opportunity and got together and started talking about ways to advocate for better labor conditions on archaeological projects and more involvement in the decision-making processes of archaeological research and conservation. And so in 2016, Sila, a startup company, was founded that is made up of all members of the local community of Petra, and it is invested in training local people in the archaeological process, documenting their expertise, certifying their expertise, and then contracting with archaeologists so that every archaeologist works with an expert labor force who is paid and treated as an expert labor force. And when I started hearing about this project, I questioned how will you possibly get archaeologists to do that? Like the whole point is that they want to pay low wages. They're not interested in expertise. They don't want to be challenged. But they're doing something really brilliant, which is that they're packaging together all of the sort of informal work that local communities have always done. So they'll find your housing, they'll find your car, they'll negotiate the best rates for food. And then all of that is under one contract, and that includes the wages for the expert laborers. So you don't really realize that you're paying expert laborers as expert laborers, because instead of paying 1 JD for a tomato, you're appropriately paying, you know, a few cents for a tomato. And so they're performing that fixer role in a formalized way. And so they've been working, like I said, since 2016. They've been having a lot of success. They're now involved in rewriting the laws in Jordan about who gets to work on archaeological projects and the documentation of the expertise they should have and experience they should have. And so my current project is following this company. I'm wrapping up my fieldwork with them and documenting the degree to which they can actually change these conditions that I have laid out in the first half of this talk, because I think there is a path forward and I think that they're on it. So That is all I have for you today. I have a lot of people to thank, all listed on this slide, but I should also thank CMES, of course, for having me, and Dr. Pepe for inviting me here today. I'd love to take questions if there are any.
That was really incredible, Allison. Well, I hope the archaeologists in the audience will start typing questions using the Q&A button, as well as non-archaeologists. But let me start by asking some question on behalf of the non-archaeologists.
Yeah.
So if you could contextualize your intervention here in the intellectual history of archaeology, like have there been moments of reckoning around empire, colonialism, around, I'm thinking here of like the feminist interventions of people like Donna Haraway with situational knowledges, like what has the subdiscipline of archaeology, what has that intellectual history look like, and where do you fit in? Where does
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, so I would say since the late 80s, early 90s, archaeology has been really invested in thinking about its political alliances and political impacts and sort of the subjectivity of archaeologists in the present. That was a movement called post-processualism that was all about the idea that archaeology isn't just a scientific process, it's not objective. We're asking questions about the past, and that's fundamentally a historical endeavor, and it's shaped by who we are in the present and who's asking the questions. And so we did that work and led to big debates, rifts, fights in the field that I think have settled out a lot. And then in the probably mid 90s, early 2000s, there started being this subfield that has grown and grown and grown called community archaeology that is very much invested in engaging the community in archaeological work in meaningful ways. And that work has been super impactful. You can now get MA degrees in public or community archaeology. Like it is, I think, honestly becoming more of a subfield and becoming kind of a way of life or a norm in archaeology. But I don't think that there's been a reckoning with the concept of labor or with archaeology as an industry, or with the sort of structural, with the sort of basic structural ways in which archaeology is organized on the ground. So a lot of community archaeology work has been invested in issues like repatriation, which is incredibly important, or building local museums on sites, or inviting local community members to help decide the research questions for a project. But I don't think, and I say this pretty outright and unapologetically in my book, I don't think we've thought about ourselves as employers. I think that I just don't think that we've done that work. And so even on projects like the one in Çatalhöyük, where there has been a lot of effort to build a museum, invest in craft initiatives for women, hire women, there's been a lot of efforts to bring local community members into every step of the archaeological process. There hasn't been a fundamental reimagining of what it means to hire local community members to do the manual work of archaeology and see that as distinct from the rest of the project. And so to me, that's where I see my contribution coming in, is to kind of applaud the good work that's been done in community archaeology, which I genuinely do, but also to suggest that maybe there's some deeper reckoning that still needs to happen.
Thank you. I have many more questions, but we do have two questions from Michelle de Gruchy. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Michelle. So I'm going to read them out loud. So Michelle writes, thanks for the fascinating talk. In the Çatalhöyük, again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, skills network, there was a small cluster of individuals separated well below the main cluster. Who are they? Why are they so distant from the core group? And then follow-up question, how can archaeologists contact SELA if they're interested in hiring them?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll share my screen because I am back to the slide in the question. So yeah, here at Çatalhöyük, we have this cluster of people that are distinct from the rest of the group. And those are the people that I was talking about who just do GPR and subsurface radar. So they use very specialized machinery. They only started coming towards the end of the project. This network is kind of it's like if you combined all of the years of the teams into one, which I think some network scientists, there's some debate over whether or not you should really do that. But they're distinct because they didn't really work with other people, and they were very, very specialized in their skills. So they're the ones who we don't see connected to anyone else. And then, yeah, the second question, how can archaeologists contact CELA? They have a website. I would say they're most present and active on Facebook. So they are called CELA for Vocational Training and Cultural Heritage. And I don't know the website offhand, but if you search that, it will come up. I think it's like celajo.com or something, but Google it or go on Facebook, and yeah, I'm sure they'd be very, very happy to hear from you.
Thank you, Allison. We have another question by Jan Pill. So Jan writes, I am interested in the topic of power relations in other areas of life. For example, much research has been conducted on ensuring that interview subjects in oral history projects have a say in how they are represented. There is perhaps more respect now for accurately representing the voice of interview subject. As well, the writer Janet Malcolm has written about the fact that biographers can be respectful with regard to personal information they gather, or they can just raid, quote unquote, raid the personal space of the subject and then publish whatever they wish. This also comes up with subjects of documentaries. Does the person interviewed have a say in how the work is edited, say or not? Interested in your thoughts. Thank you, Jen. Go ahead, Alice.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that I try to get into a little bit in the book is the fact that the product of the work that is done at archaeological sites is so seldom brought back to the communities that it comes from. They're not. It's very seldom published in the languages that they can read. Like, I'm even trying to get my own book published in Arabic so that the people that I interviewed could read it. And it's just really difficult to find a publisher. Like, I could self-publish, but it's just hard. It's hard to like make sure it's distributed in those places. And so I think thank you for posting the CELA website. Yeah, I think it's just really difficult to for them to feel any sort of control over that. At Chattelhook, there was a publication of a volume in 2005, 2006, where they actually brought the local community members into the discussions that went into the final publication. And so there are quotes and transcripts from those discussions. And so it's the only instance that I've actually been able to see where the verbatim language of site workers is actually published in the products of archaeological work. But as you're pointing to, like, they didn't choose those quotes, they just offered those quotes. And then they don't really see the end products because very, very few of the people that I interviewed were fluent in English. And even if they spoke English, they didn't necessarily read English. And if they read English, they didn't read it at the level of like academic archaeological work. With regard to the documentaries, yeah, I don't think there's any sort of say in how they're portrayed, but I don't think that's so unusual. I mean, I've been in documentaries where I was very embarrassed at the outcome. So I think that's sort of like the process of the filmmaking. So, but I do think it's a really important dynamic with regard to archaeology that people's contributions are sort of wrapped in, and then they have no access to seeing the end result, and they certainly have no say in the end result. I will say your question also points to the power dynamics in my own work and my own oral histories. And, you know, I think it's very common in anthropology to like change the names and mask the identities of the people that you're interviewing for a variety of reasons. And I purposely did not do that. And I of course checked in with everyone that I was interviewing that was all right with them. And there are instances where if they said something particularly sensitive, I did change it. But my goal was very much to like actually make visible things that had been invisible. And so it was an important part of the project to name these experts in Petra that like sort of just go like anonymously thanked and everything. So they didn't necessarily get a say in how they were quoted or how they showed up, but I think that was part of the goal of the project, and the people that I interviewed were on board with it. And I don't know, you know, I brought the book back. I've done some presentations in the area and people seem happy with it, but I don't want to pretend like there's not a power dynamic in my own research either, that like I wasn't making decisions about how to represent people either.
Yeah, I would be so interested to hear your thoughts around archaeological ethics more broadly. But first, there is a question from Yasemin Nabati Mazlumi, who writes, "Thank you so much for your speech and your wonderful book." Then he proceeds, in community-based participatory research method, it is usual to assess the interests and needs of community at the beginning of research. Have you done such a process? How have you organized your interviews with community members?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, so both of the projects that I joined onto in Petra and Çatalhöyük had done needs assessments before I arrived. That was part of their sort of community engagement strategy. At Çatalhöyük, that was done by Sonia Adalay, and at Petra, it was done by the project directors. And so I was joining on as kind of part of the response to those needs assessments that was looking at whether or not the projects were fulfilling their goals of sufficiently engaging the community. My interviews, because they were mostly historical, were organized by kind of first developing a list of people that I could identify in the records, and then just going out and trying to find them and talk to them. And so I wasn't necessarily staging interventions until the stage of the photography process. So in some ways I was leading on or responding to the findings of the needs assessments that had already happened. And in some ways my own project was like an extension of that needs assessment by looking further in the past, by looking more historically. And then once we did the photography project, that was very much in the context of this work that had been done about what communities want from us and how they want to be engaged and how they don't want to be engaged.
Thank you, Allison. We have another question from Yusuf Gürsey. In Cilicia, Turkey, an underfunded expedition concerning the Luwian era, I was told, was helped by locals. A picture of a man was found to resemble one of the locals, and they engaged in the expedition and guarded and took care of the site off-season. I studied archaeometry as part of applied physics and thus interacted with archaeologists. Any similar incidents? Yeah, so I think this is a big reason why community archaeology has become like the new norm, is because we recognize that if you don't have people's buy-in, if they don't feel invested in the site, they won't protect it. And so like archaeology and looting have always been very, very like married together in the Middle East and elsewhere. Like once there's an archaeological project somewhere, you've made clear that there's something of value here. And so looting usually escalates in the wake of an archaeological project. One of the ways that we found to combat that is exactly what you're talking about, like making people feel a connection, not making people feel, but encouraging that connection and supporting that connection that they maybe already feel to the archaeological site, which is why I'm careful not to critique like too much the idea that people from Çatalhöyük feel a connection to the Neolithic people. Like I'm not here to challenge whether that's real or substantial. And I think those sorts of feelings of connection are important to the preservation of the cultural heritage. So I think that's the direction that archaeology is heading, is in fostering that sort of connection. I'm fascinated by the story of a guy feeling like he looks like someone from the past. I love that, but I do have examples of that from Çatalhöyük. There's a story that one man told me of something they found, and he said the archaeologists couldn't figure out what it was. He was like, but we have them all over our house. They're like evil eye type of icons, like kind of like the Hamza kind of thing, like I don't know, just guarding away evil. And he felt like he could interpret it because of the similarity in appearance between these two objects. And so he felt connected to Çatalhöyük because of that affiliation. So I think those stories are common, maybe not so much a physical like resemblance like you're talking about, although I love that. But I do think that, yeah, archaeologists are really interested in fostering those connections that people feel and encouraging local conservation of sites. I think there's a way that can go wrong. Archaeology has a long history of sort of being patronizing about that and saying, well, you need to care about this site and protect it. I know it's not important to you. I know that that protecting it stops you from farming this land, which maybe gives you food, but actually the history is more important. So archaeologists have a long history of kind of, I think, overplaying that connection and telling people what they need to care about, which isn't great. But of course, promoting local collaboration and site conservation is the next step. And that's exactly what CELA is doing, which is why I brought them up at the end. Well, maybe I can take advantage of this lull in questions and ask, One, I'm interested in the sort of political economic aspect of this. Is this part of the neoliberal sort of neoliberalization of labor and how that affects archaeological knowledge production? And also, what are the political and juridical investments in this local economy of the Jordanian state?
Yeah. So I mean, I think this is going to be the meat of this current project that I'm looking at, which is more focused on the present, less focused on the historical stuff. Although of course there's a history of the political economy as well. But I think in this time when there's all this money flowing into Jordan for humanitarian aid for the influx of refugees that have come in over the last few years, that is like tied up in cultural heritage. And suddenly you have these organizations like IOM or the Norwegian Refugee Council, like just the Danish Refugee Council. You have all these organizations that are funding cultural heritage projects. So I was in Jordan from February to August, and I was watching these projects where they're refugee organizations. That's what they're there to do, and they're doing these like cash for work projects on cultural heritage, and it's very, very wild. And they're using a lot of the same language that's coming from community archaeology, but not just community archaeology. We see the same language in sustainable development circles of like the need for local investment, for local engagement. And so this is what my current project is looking at, is how local engagement, other people have written about the tyranny of participation, this idea of like local engagement like kind of only goes so far. It's not really set up to succeed. It's kind of set up to fail, and ultimately serves the concentration of capital in the same hands as always. And so when you're talking about this process of neoliberalization, there's a scholar named Shada Abu Khafaja who's written about how the heritage sphere is like just rife with this neoliberal rhetoric and how like these like local community projects, local community engagement projects are just, they pay these like minimum wages, they do cash for work, they're under the table, the end result is not really high quality, and it's very much a new way of these international humanitarian organizations trying to have some sort of visible impact, some sort of like shiny product that they can hold up, but not actually doing like meaningful community engagement, not fostering democratic engagement, not fostering community representation in a meaningful way. And so, I will be like writing and exploring those depressing angles in the next project.
Thank you. Maybe I'll ask just one more final set of questions. So are there the differences between Turkey and Jordan? Are those particular to the Middle East, or do this sort of patterns appear in other parts of the world? And are there particularities to whether the sites are run by elite institutions in the US or not, or elite rock star archaeologists,
right,
or not? And sort of, if you wanted to speak to the moment, you don't have to, but I also wanted to give you that opportunity.
No, thank you. So I do have a chapter in the book where I take this global and I look at similar trajectories and histories in other contexts. I am a believer in ethnography, despite the sort of crisis of the present moment for cultural anthropology. I am a believer in ethnography as a means of knowing more about the world and about people's experiences. And so while I believe in that chapter, and I think I make a good argument, I didn't do the like on the ground ethnographic work that I did here. And so I do think we see it playing out in sub-Saharan Africa. I think we see it playing out in India and South Asian contexts. I think we see it playing out a little bit in Latin America, although I think that some of the community engagement work has been more meaningful there. There are some powerful unions of site workers, particularly in Mexico. Powerful is a relative term. I'm not talking about like they run the world, but they have been able to mobilize and shut down sites and have impactful strikes and things. And that is a little bit of what SILA is trying to do in Jordan, although unionization in Jordan is a difficult path. It's tough to start a new union. So I think Latin America is a place where we can look to for some alternate histories, some alternate paths forward. But I do think it is a global process, just as colonialism was global, right, or is global. And so then to speak to your other question about, yeah, the position of the archaeologists, I maybe cynically, I think this happens kind of all over. To be honest, I think in some ways, the more well-researched, well-resourced excavations are a little bit less exploitative. They have more resources that they can pay site workers. They're coming from places that engage with these like more up-to-date, more progressive theoretical traditions. And so Çatalhöyük was run by Stanford. It had a multi-million-dollar budget. It is a famously very well-resourced excavation. So a lot of their site worker engagement projects were because of the time and resources they had to devote to kind of extra things besides just purely the excavation, versus some excavations run on like a shoestring budget. Also, I've brought up this issue to some of the archaeologists named by site workers in Petra who have said, oh, this is somebody who did this. And not to be like, oh, someone accused you of this, but just, you know, oh, this is a story I'm hearing in Petra. And I have very rarely had an archaeologist say, no, that doesn't happen, or to say, oh, that's a mischaracterization. Almost always they say, yeah, you know, I only have so much to pay. Like I can't be paying somebody who's claiming to be an expert. If they're claiming to be an expert, they're probably asking for more money and I can't afford it. And so I actually think like the lack of funding for archaeology is tied up in the exploitation of workers, which is not a surprise, right? Like scarcity, and especially false scarcity, is like the underlying context of exploitation in any sort of sector, in any sort of industry, and archaeology is not any different. So it's not to excuse elite archaeologists or elite institutions at all. If anything, the fact that there are very well-researched excavations that haven't really done much work to engage local communities meaningfully is an indictment of the use of their mountains of resources. But I don't think it's like a uniquely elite issue or uniquely Middle East issue. It's a global issue, and one that tracks across archaeology.
Allison, this is such important work. When will we see you in Iraq? Asked Karar Asaba.
I would love to go to Iraq. You know, when I started this project, I first started interviewing site workers in 2011, and it was just a time when going to Iraq was like just not really thinkable. And it's so exciting that it's opening up, and that could be a possibility. The first Arabic dialect class I ever took was Iraqi, and then I had no chance to ever apply it. So I would love to go to Iraq. I think that is very much in the future. I just have to wrap up this work in Jordan first before I can set my sights on another project. I think we all know that struggle of just there's too much to do and too much to look into and too many exciting directions. So yeah, I'm facing that as well.
Well, thank you so much. This was just wonderful. It was a timely talk, and it was it's necessary work, especially right now. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Check out the CMES calendar for our upcoming colloquia. All right, bye-bye.